April 9, 1865. The sun was setting on a nation torn apart by 4 years of brutal conflict. But what unfolded in the final hour of the Civil War wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the moment that forever reshaped the destiny of America. Secrets whispered by soldiers, decisions made in tense silence, and a surrender that echoed through history. What really happened in those last 60 minutes? Stay with us, because the truth you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Civil War's final chapter. But before we continue, please like and subscribe to our channel to support our growing community. The last hour of the American Civil War was marked by the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865, effectively ending the war. Lee's army, running out of supplies and surrounded by Union forces, had no option but to surrender after a final desperate charge by Confederate troops failed to break the Union lines. The two generals met to agree on terms that allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and provided food rations for the starving troops. This surrender paved the way for the cessation of hostilities, the reunion of the country, and the Reconstruction era that followed, fundamentally changing American history. Throughout the war's last critical clashes, many men perished as the Confederacy desperately battled Union troops that overwhelmed them. By 1865, the Confederate Army was in disarray. Over 4 brutal years, Union and rebel soldiers collided repeatedly in combat, yet both factions were increasingly exhausted. By April 1865, James Longstreet, a trusted advisor to Robert E. Lee, told the general the conclusion was approaching following multiple Southern defeats. Confederate General John Brown Gordon recounted the Army of Northern Virginia was now merely a shadow of its prior strength. This evaluation hardly deterred Lee. Quite the opposite. The general proved obstinate, proclaiming the South held sacred principles to uphold and rights to protect. He pressed forward, aware it was futile. The insistence for Lee to capitulate arose from numerous officers and subordinates. On April 7, 1865, his closest aides confronted him. General Long informed him, recognizing the hardships confronting the Army and deeming its escape impossible. Several senior officers, motivated by devotion and compassion for their leader and seeking to ease his burden and lessen the sting of loss, offered to tell him that, in their view, the fight had arrived where more opposition was futile and the conflict ought to cease and talks commence for the Army's surrender. Lee reacted adversely, demanding they keep fighting. Gordon noted Lee understood the soldiers' dedication. They were tattered, famished, and prepared to stop. But Lee and Longstreet were resolute on advancing, with Longstreet pushing Southern forces to resist. Lee charged onward, and the Battle of Appomattox Court House commenced. As Gordon later recorded, Lee frequently faced grave peril from projectiles and gunfire during these rides. Ultimately, his commanders advised surrender. Lee consented, a move largely concluding days earlier when Lee's officers implored the general to yield. But on that pivotal 1865 day, General Lee's capitulation established the model for subsequent large-scale surrenders, culminating in the war's formal end. The general rode constantly, urging troops to sustain the war endeavor. Meanwhile, Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant devised a strategy to halt General Lee. Correspondence between the two commanders persisted as Lee withdrew westward, finally crossing the James River. He realized their cause was lost,
leading to the renowned Appomattox meeting. Yet more obstacles remained before the decisive encounter occurred. As the conflict neared its conclusion, Lee's forces started to exhibit signs of collapse, and a Union triumph seemed imminent. Grant's soldiers perceived victory within reach. Possessing tactical superiority and morale elevated, they advanced swiftly without a single laggard in their ranks. As Grant would later record in his memoirs, Union forces acted swiftly and without any straggling. Grant understood Confederate troops were depleted. After conversing with a captured rebel general the prior evening, he acquired all necessary intelligence to set the stage for the war's termination. The general informed Grant. General Ewell had stated that when we had got to Mahone's line, carrying a message to General Lee. Regarding that note, before he became the 18th President of the United States and championed civil rights for all, Grant was a true battlefield leader. In his April 7th dispatch to Lee, Grant penned, "The outcomes of the past week must persuade you of the futility of continued resistance by the Army of Northern Virginia in this fight. Though not sharing the view you state regarding the impossibility of further opposition by the Army of Northern Virginia, I acknowledge your wish to prevent needless bloodshed. Thus, before weighing your proposal, inquire what conditions you will extend on the surrender of that segment of the Confederate Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General." Lee disputed with Grant about the dire state of his army and replied, "General, I have received your communication of this day. I sense it is so, and deem it my obligation to remove from myself the accountability for any more effusion of blood." And it was the responsibility of their leaders to negotiate the most favorable terms possible, while they still retained a right to demand concessions. The Confederate troops understood their fate was sealed, yet persisted. Following deliberation over whether to capitulate, Lee resolved to continue combat. But nothing of that signified at Appomattox when Ulysses S. Grant stepped forward. According to Longstreet's battle recollection, a flag of truce emerged by torchlight ahead of their fruitless effort to persuade Lee to surrender. General Grant, spotting a chance to seize control of events, dispatched a note to Lee from across the battlefield. They started perceiving the conclusion of their 4-year struggle. Nothing appeared to halt their withdrawal. Ultimately, Sheridan severed Lee's forces from supplies and seized 6,000 captives in the Sailor's Creek vicinity. Such incidents accelerated Confederate desertions and Lee's eventual capitulation. Meanwhile, Grant and Lee's written exchange persisted, with Lee dispatching another message to the Union General late that evening after getting Grant's correspondence. "I have intercepted Confederate forces at Appomattox Station and taken 3 of his supply trains. If you can urgently advance your division here tonight, significant outcomes await us in the morning." When not occupied destroying Southern food sources or capturing railways to block movement, Sheridan commanded his cavalry on an operation to dislodge rebel troops. The engagement concluded with Lee displaying a white banner. He proved somewhat melodramatic about it also. Ultimately, he proclaimed, "Nothing remains except to meet General Grant, and I would choose death 1,000 times." On April 9th, Grant and Lee convened in Wilmer Mclean's parlor to discuss the Confederacy's capitulation. That afternoon of April 9th, 1865, Grant wasn't formally attired for war's end. He hadn't anticipated his efforts succeeding so rapidly and wore what he termed coarse attire. Gordon eventually commanded one last hopeless assault against Federal troops, seizing 2 Union artillery pieces during the action. But Grant disapproved of the notion. Further communications ensued, culminating with General Chamberlain reading, "The objective was solely trapping Lee's army." General Philip Sheridan, leading Union horse soldiers, outpaced Lee's columns and obstructed their retreat. At the finale, he stated this solely aimed at cornering Lee's army. Gordon later expressed pride in the combat, noting courageous lads in ragged gray cheered while their standards flew victoriously that final dawn. But as Gordon and his men celebrated, Federal soldiers kept advancing. The units had marched overnight for the sole purpose of surrounding Robert E. Lee's forces and severing their provisions. They were prepared to march without meals and proceed without respite until completion, though exhaustion plagued them. As Grant later recalled, this provoked a fierce clash as the foe awoke that day. He stood ready when Lee raised the white flag, though some Federal troops suspected a ruse. It was hazardous, yet effective. Grant noted his division moved with such speed that it startled the enemy. "Since peace restoration must be everyone's only aim, I wish to ascertain whether your proposals will produce that outcome." Lee consented to confer with Grant at 10 a.m. the next day, though he did not propose surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia, but sought the conditions of your offer. Frankly, I believe no crisis necessitates this army's capitulation. As he observed Lee, he paused to notice the decorated sword at the officer's hip. While doing so, Grant determined demanding Confederate commanders relinquish their swords would constitute needless humiliation. Having achieved surrender, he declined to strip them of their belongings, sabers, or mounts. So he amended the official surrender terms with a line declaring, "This excludes the sidearms of officers or the personal horses or baggage." After reviewing Grant's conditions, Lee drafted his own letter accepting them. The two generals shook hands, and Lee exited to the front steps of Mclean's residence. While departing, Lee failed to notice Union officers who respectfully rose as he approached. Standing on the lowest step, he stared toward the valley, rubbing his hands together distractedly. Porter, witnessing the event, characterized it as a grave affair. In Mclean's parlor, Grant and Lee discussed surrender terms privately. After their initial discussion, additional officers joined. General Horace Porter depicted the setting. We entered and discovered General Grant seated at a marble-topped table centered in the room with Lee beside a small oval table near the front window, corner opposite the door through which we entered, facing General Grant. They settled quietly as surrender talks continued. During negotiations, Grant swiftly penned his terms for Lee's capitulation. With surrender secured, Grant telegraphed Washington announcing the tremendous news. He informed them, "General Lee yielded the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon under terms I proposed." He'd later note in his memoirs that his soldiers began firing a 100-gun salute to celebrate victory. This displeased Grant, who ordered it halted. He clarified the Confederates were now captives, and he refused to celebrate their defeat. But he was overruled. Hours later, the generals held their decisive meeting at the Mclean house just outside Appomattox. Lee arrived in full dress uniform, including a valuable sword. Recalling the encounter, Grant later remarked, "In my coarse travel attire, I must have appeared starkly incongruous beside a man so impeccably attired, 6 feet tall, and of flawless bearing." This concluded the American Civil War, enabling hostilities to cease, national reunification, and subsequent Reconstruction. Lee proceeded to break the news of his surrender to his former troops. The Appomattox capitulation signified the war's end. As Lee departed, Grant exited the residence and saluted the ex-Confederate general by raising his hat. Lee reciprocated the gesture and rode into the unsettled light to inform those formerly under his authority. Grant felt relieved the conflict concluded and readied himself for the historic legacy awaiting him. Though the surrender halted fighting between these armies, sporadic clashes persisted for several weeks afterward. Yet Grant achieved the extraordinary feat of persuading Lee to capitulate, bringing the war to a decisive conclusion. Upon finishing his mission, Grant informed his troops, "The struggle has ended. The Confederates are our fellow citizens once more." So as the dust settled on that fateful day, the last hour of the Civil War didn't just mark the end of a conflict, it ignited the beginning of a new America, forever changed by the courage, sacrifice, and decisions made in those final moments. But here's the question that still puzzles historians and sparks debate today. What if things had gone differently in that last hour? How might America's future have changed? I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened in those final moments? Drop your theories, questions, or insights in the comments below. And if you found this journey into history as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories that shaped our world.